The door opened with a soft click, and Ethan felt something inside him jolt. 3 seconds, and the night shifted. Claire stepped in, soaked from the rain, her breath unsteady as she brushed wet hair from her face. The familiar warmth of home thinned around them as a scent drifted in with her, sharp and unmistakable, a cologne he had never worn. She tried to steady her voice while saying the dinner ran long, but the words landed unevenly, trembling like her fingers as she clutched her purse. Ethan watched her avoid his eyes, watched the way her shoulders tightened as if bracing for questions he hadn't yet asked. The storm pressed against the house, rattling the windows as his pulse matched the rhythm, heavier with each passing second. Would you forgive someone if the truth was worse than the lie? The thought anchored itself deep, colder than the rain she carried in with her. And as Claire stepped further inside, he wondered if she realized the silence already knew her secret, long before she spoke a single word. Ethan stepped into the living room, pretending to straighten a stack of envelopes just to avoid looking directly at Claire, who followed in hesitant steps that sounded too careful to be casual. The faint cologne, unfamiliar, bold, unquestionably masculine, drifted around her, settling into the room like a truth refusing to stay hidden. She spoke lightly about work, her voice trying to keep its usual rhythm, but every few words slipped or wavered. He noticed the way she kept smoothing her damp hair behind her ear, a nervous repetition she always tried to hide. The storm outside rumbled, but the heaviness inside the house felt louder, spreading between them as he struggled with the questions tightening in his chest. What if betrayal was the only way to survive? The thought unnerved him, yet he couldn't silence it as he watched her fight to appear composed. Claire eased herself onto the couch, her movements careful and small, as if she feared breaking the fragile calm between them. Ethan leaned against the tall bookshelf across the room, his silence sharper than any question he could have asked. She began recounting the evening at the work dinner, adding names and details too quickly, tripping over the story every time she tried to steady it. He noticed her fingers digging into the cushion, gripping harder whenever she lost her place. The storm cracked loudly, and she flinched, revealing the fear threaded beneath her voice. In that moment, Ethan felt their home shift. No longer a place of comfort, but a space filled with half-truths and shadows that moved with every breath she took. Claire finally lifted her gaze, offering a small smile that trembled at the edges as she insisted she was simply exhausted. Ethan stepped closer, stopping just in front of her, feeling the tension ripple through the space between them. Her breath hitched at his nearness, and he could sense how hard she worked to keep her composure. Her words were careful, chosen like fragile glass pieces she hoped wouldn't crack under scrutiny. The storm hammered more violently against the windows, drowning out the softer sounds of the house, making every unspoken fear ring louder. Ethan felt an ache in his chest, heavier than he expected, realizing that trust had begun to unravel long before tonight. The house grew painfully quiet as Claire rose from the couch and walked toward the kitchen, her steps quick and uneven. Ethan followed slowly, watching the stiffness in her shoulders and the way she hesitated before reaching for a glass on the counter. It slipped slightly in her hand before she steadied it, and the small clink sounded louder than it should have. He asked again, this time softer, if she had anything she wanted to tell him. The question hung in the kitchen air, thick and unmoving. Claire froze with her back turned, her breathing shallow, her silence stretched thin enough to tear. For a second, Ethan thought she might speak the truth, whatever it was, but she only whispered that she was fine, the crack in her voice exposing a truth her words tried to hide. Morning light crept through the blinds, thin and cold, settling over a silence that felt stranger than the storm from the night before. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the faint imprint where Claire had slept, the sheet still carrying her warmth even though she had risen before him. The scent of that unfamiliar cologne had faded from the air, but not from his thoughts. Lingering like a bruise, he couldn't stop pressing. He heard her in the kitchen, moving carefully, as if each sound risked breaking whatever fragile peace they had managed to hold overnight. He ran a hand over his face, drained but restless, feeling the weight of questions he hadn't asked. Questions that now felt too sharp to ignore. The taste of unease settled bitterly in his mouth as he wondered whether the truth was something he had already sensed long before last night. He rose slowly, feet cold against the floor, and walked toward the kitchen, unsure whether he wanted answers or simply feared hearing them. Claire stood at the counter pouring coffee, her movements too precise, too controlled, as if she feared that even a small tremor might reveal everything she wouldn't say. Ethan entered the kitchen, and she greeted him with a smile so carefully shaped it almost hurt to look at. The steam rising from the mug curled upward like a fragile truce neither of them believed in. He reached for his own cup, their hands nearly brushing, but she pulled hers back too quickly, breaking the moment before it had a chance to settle. Ethan felt a knot twist tighter in his chest, the unease from last night settling into something heavier. Claire tried to talk about her schedule for the day, but her voice carried a nervous brightness that didn't match her tired eyes. He listened, wondering when they had become two people performing normalcy inside the same home, afraid of the truths they might uncover if they stopped pretending. Ethan drove to work with the radio off, letting the quiet wrap around him like a fog. The city passed by in blurred colors, but his mind replayed the night before in sharp fragments. The scent, the tremble in her hands, the way her voice faltered. Each detail pressed against him as if trying to form a message he wasn't ready to decode. At a red light, he rested his forehead against the steering wheel, breathing slowly, trying to steady the unease tightening across his ribs. He wondered if Claire had truly meant her words this morning, or if she had simply worn composure like another layer of clothing. The car behind him honked softly when the light changed, snapping him back to motion. As he drove on, he realized that doubt had begun reshaping the edges of every memory they shared, casting shadows in places he once felt safe, and he feared those shadows were only beginning to grow. Claire stepped out of her office building later that afternoon, clutching her bag closer than usual as she walked across the plaza. Her co-workers chatted behind her, but their voices felt distant. Swallowed by the weight pressing against her chest, she kept replaying Ethan's expression from the morning. The quiet ache in his eyes, the way he hesitated before speaking. It lingered like a bruise on her conscience. She wished she could silence the guilt threading through her thoughts, but every step made her feel more exposed, as if the world could see the truth she was trying to bury. She paused near the crosswalk, inhaling sharply, trying to steady herself. The wind tugged at her hair, cold and insistent, reminding her of everything she couldn't undo. She wondered how long she could keep pretending, and whether the lie had already cost her more than the truth ever would. When Ethan returned home that evening, the house felt strangely still, as if holding its breath again. Claire was already in the living room, curled on the edge of the couch with a book she wasn't reading, her eyes lifting the moment he entered. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The quiet stretched, bending under its own weight, filled with everything they both avoided naming. He asked about her day, and she answered quickly, too quickly, her words falling like rehearsed lines. Ethan nodded, pretending to accept them, though something in him tightened with every syllable. She set the book aside, her fingers brushing the cover in small, nervous circles. The faint evening light cast long shadows across the room, darkening the space between them. Ethan sat across from her, feeling the distance grow even as they shared the same room, and he wondered how long two people could live beside each other while drifting quietly apart. The night settled heavily over the house as Ethan stood alone in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the living room clock. Claire had gone upstairs earlier, saying she was exhausted, but her footsteps had sounded too rushed, too eager to escape the weight of unspoken things between them. Ethan leaned against the wall, running a slow hand through his hair while his thoughts spiraled back to the scent on her clothes, the unevenness in her voice, the way she avoided his eyes each time he tried to meet them. The silence felt sharpened now, pressing in from every corner like a confession waiting to be heard. He wondered when the air in their home had become so fragile, when the simplest moments began carrying the heaviest meanings. A part of him wanted to push the conversation forward, to force the truth out into the open, but another part feared what might break if he did. The longer he stood there, the more he realized that trust wasn't the only thing slipping. So was the ground beneath them. Claire lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while the darkness pressed against her like a quiet witness. The sheets around her felt cold, despite her warmth, as if the space itself recoiled from the tension lingering in the house. She tried to steady her breathing, but each inhale felt laced with guilt she couldn't ease. She replayed Ethan's silence from earlier, the way he watched her from across the room with softness that hurt more than anger ever could. The truth moved restlessly inside her, twisting like a knot she couldn't loosen. She wished she could rewind time to something simpler, before one wrong choice had begun unraveling everything she held dear. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, trying to quiet the emotion rising in her chest, but no amount of stillness could drown the fear that tomorrow might bring questions she could no longer avoid answering. Ethan sat at his desk in the small study, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating scattered notes and receipts. He wasn't actually reading. His mind wandered instead to the small details he had overlooked in recent weeks. Late nights, rushed explanations, the sudden change in her perfume. He rested his elbows on the desk, fingers laced together, trying to make sense of the puzzle that felt both familiar and alien. The quiet room amplified every shift of the house. The creak of settling wood, the faint hum of pipes, the whisper of Claire moving upstairs. He closed his eyes, feeling an ache build behind them. He didn't want to become someone who searched for signs of betrayal, and yet the unease refused to loosen its grip. He wondered if love could survive this kind of doubt, or if doubt was already something deeper, something darker, shaping itself into truth. Claire eventually left the bedroom, her footsteps quiet as she moved down the stairs. She found herself standing in the dark living room, hands lightly gripping the back of the sofa as she stared into the faint glow from the streetlights outside. The emptiness of the room mirrored the uncertainty inside her. She knew Ethan sensed something. He was too observant not to, but the thought of confirming his fears left her breathless. She wanted to protect him, protect them, but the lie she carried had begun to take shape, pressing at the edges of every conversation. She rested her forehead against the back of the couch, exhaling shakily. The shadows stretched long across the floor, making the room feel colder than it should. She wondered how much longer she could stand in this space between truth and comfort before one of them finally shattered. Ethan eventually left the study, drawn by the feeling that Claire was no longer upstairs. He found her in the living room, framed by soft shadows, her posture tense as she turned toward him. For a moment, neither spoke. Something in her expression softened, as if she had expected him to stay away, as if seeing him there brought both relief and fear. He stepped closer, stopping just far enough to give her space. He said her name quietly, and she flinched, not from him, but from the truth she felt pressing behind it. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her breath trembling. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes, the weight she carried, the truth waiting to break through. And in that fragile moment between them, he felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable. Like the first crack forming in a wall neither had wanted to build. The morning was unnervingly quiet as Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, fingers tapping lightly against his mug in an uneven rhythm he couldn't seem to stop. Claire had stepped outside to take a phone call, her voice low, slipping through a cracked door like a whisper made of secrets. He didn't mean to listen, but every faint word sent a tremor through him, turning doubt into something sharper. He tried to focus on his breathing, on the sunlight slowly crawling across the countertop, but tension clung to him like a second skin. He wondered whether the distance between them now was something they could mend, or if he was simply watching the slow unraveling of everything they had built. When Claire finally returned, closing the door with soft caution, Her eyes avoided his, and the silence that followed felt too loud to ignore. Something had shifted. He felt it deep in his chest. An ache that didn't let go. Claire stepped deeper into the kitchen, setting her phone on the counter with a small thud that echoed louder than intended. Ethan lifted his gaze, studying her carefully, searching for something familiar beneath the quiet exhaustion etched into her face. She began speaking about an early meeting she needed to attend, but her voice carried a fractured quality, like she was piecing each word together as she went. Ethan nodded, but the weight behind her tone dug into him, making the air feel thick. He wanted to reach out, to hold on to something solid between them, but the space separating them felt like a fragile line he was afraid to cross. Claire tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hands trembling slightly. She looked like someone balancing on a precipice, one step away from a confession, or from retreat. Later that afternoon, Ethan sat alone in his car outside a grocery store, unable to shake the feeling that something crucial had slipped through his fingers. He watched people move in and out of the building, their casual rhythm a sharp contrast to the tightness coiling in his chest. He replayed fragments of the morning, the hushed phone call, the way Claire's eyes refused to settle on his, the tremor in her voice when she mentioned her schedule. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, feeling uncertainty ripple through him. He didn't want to become someone defined by suspicion, but every moment left him with fewer answers and more unease. As cars passed and sunlight flickered across his windshield, he wondered how much truth he could handle, and whether the truth had already found its way into the empty spaces between their breaths. Claire stepped out of her building at dusk. The sky brushed with fading orange as she wrapped her arms around herself against the cool air. She looked over her shoulder once, as if ensuring no one followed, before walking toward the parking lot with hurried steps. Her phone buzzed in her bag, and she fumbled to silence it, her breath catching when she recognized the name flashing on the screen. She shoved it deeper, as if hiding it would quiet the panic rising in her chest. The world around her seemed too bright, too open, exposing every crack she tried to conceal. She paused beside her car, gripping the door handle as she inhaled shakily. The truth was beginning to feel too heavy to carry alone, and yet she still couldn't bring herself to release it. When Claire returned home later, the house was darker than usual, lit only by a single lamp in the corner. Ethan stood near the window, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow from the street outside. She hesitated in the doorway, her breath catching as their eyes met. The distance between them felt sharper tonight, charged with unspoken truths neither could bring themselves to voice. Ethan asked if everything was all right, but his voice held a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. She offered a soft answer, one she hoped sounded steady, but her words wavered just enough to betray her. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. The quiet hum of the house, the muted city noises, the fragile pull between them. And in that fragile pause, Claire felt something inside her falter, slipping dangerously close to breaking. The next morning arrived with a heaviness that settled before either of them spoke. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the untouched mug of coffee cooling by his hand as the minutes stretched thin around him. Claire moved quietly behind him, her footsteps soft, almost hesitant, as if any sound might splinter the fragile stillness they were holding together. He could feel her presence without turning, her breath catching, her hands fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater, the tension radiating from her like a silent confession. Ethan tried to swallow the knot growing in his throat, but every moment seemed to echo with everything unsaid. When she finally whispered his name, her voice wavered, and he felt something shift inside him. Fear, longing, or maybe the realization that a truth was finally close enough to touch. The quiet between them throbbed with uncertainty, and as he slowly turned toward her, he wondered whether the truth she carried would heal him, or destroy everything left between them. Claire stepped closer, her breath unsteady as she searched for the words that refused to form. Ethan waited, every muscle tight, bracing for an answer he had chased in silence for too long. She opened and closed her mouth again, clearly struggling, her eyes darting away before she forced herself to meet his gaze. The seconds stretched into something unbearably fragile. She admitted that things had been complicated lately, that she had been overwhelmed, that she had made mistakes she didn't know how to face. Ethan felt his heart drop, even though her words were vague and incomplete, carrying more weight in their hesitation than in their meaning. He didn't interrupt. He could. He watched her hands tremble as she tried to gather courage, and he realized that whatever truth she was preparing to offer would change their lives in some irreversible way. Each breath felt colder as he waited for the next piece of her unraveling confession. Ethan stepped back as her voice faltered again, trying to make sense of the pieces she offered. The room felt smaller, shrinking around the weight of her trembling words. He asked gently, almost pleading, whether the Cologne, the late nights, and the sudden distance were all tied to this mistake she kept circling. Claire's breath caught sharply, and her eyes glistened with panic, as if cornered by a truth she had hoped wouldn't surface. She shook her head at first, whispering a soft no, but her voice cracked halfway through, betraying her uncertainty. Ethan felt something inside him bend, not quite breaking, but dangerously close. The quiet stretched once more, and Claire finally whispered that she had been meeting someone about a situation she wasn't ready to explain. The vague answer hollowed him out, leaving space for every fear he had tried to ignore. Doubt, sharper now, settled into the room like a third presence watching them both unravel. Claire turned away, unable to withstand the weight of his gaze. She pressed a hand against her forehead, her breathing shallow as she tried to calm the storm gathering inside. Ethan took a small step forward, wanting to close the distance but unsure whether she would welcome it or recoil. The room felt suspended in a fragile balance. One wrong move, and everything might collapse. Claire whispered that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that things had spiraled faster than she expected. Her voice trembled at the edges, carrying a sorrow that twisted painfully through the room. Ethan felt his chest tighten, torn between wanting answers and wanting to protect her from her own breaking point. The moment felt unbearably raw, a tipping point they both recognized but neither dared to acknowledge out loud. Every breath echoed with the truth, hovering just outside her reach. At last, Claire lowered her hand and turned to face him fully, tears brimming but refusing to fall. Ethan felt the air shift, the quiet sharpening as she prepared to say something that changed the tone of the room instantly. She whispered that she needed to tell him everything, but not here, not in the middle of a morning that felt too fragile to hold the truth. Her voice trembled with urgency, as if the confession itself carried a weight that needed a safer place to land. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart thudding unsteadily as he nodded, unsure whether he wanted to hear what came next or run from it entirely. The tension pressed closer, tightening around both of them like a slow closing grip. Claire stepped forward, her breath shaking as she said there was more, much more, than he realized. And in that fragile moment, Ethan understood that the truth wasn't just near. It was already unfolding. The drive was silent as Ethan and Claire moved through the dimming evening streets, the sky washed in layers of fading blue and soft violet. Claire had asked him to come with her, saying only that she needed to show him something before she could explain the rest. Her voice had carried a tremor that made refusal impossible. Now, inside the car, the air felt too tight, too thin, as if the truth itself waited in the empty spaces between their breaths. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady the storm in his chest while Claire stared out the window, fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. He wanted to ask where they were going, but the question caught in his throat, swallowed by the fear of her answer. The world outside blurred into streaks of light as the tension wound tighter around them. Finally, Claire whispered that she hoped he wouldn't hate her for what he was about to hear, and the dread in her voice chilled him more deeply than anything she had said before. They reached a small parking lot near the edge of town, where the glow of distant streetlights barely touched the cracked pavement. Claire stepped out first, her shoulders hunched as though bracing against something heavier than the cold air. Ethan followed, shutting the door gently, the the sound echoing across the empty lot like a warning. Claire walked a few steps ahead before stopping, turning to face him with eyes that looked both terrified and resolute. She said she had been meeting someone here, someone who knew something she couldn't ignore. Ethan's pulse quickened, each beat louder than the last as he felt the world starting to tilt beneath him. Claire swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she insisted it wasn't what he thought. But that didn't stop the sting of dread from spreading through his veins. The truth hovered dangerously close, thickening the air between them. Claire finally confessed that she had been meeting someone for several weeks, someone who had contacted her with information she didn't know how to handle alone. Ethan felt his breath stutter as she explained that the cologne he smelled wasn't from a date or a secret affair, but from a man she'd been speaking to privately, someone who claimed he knew things about their family. Things she couldn't ignore. Her words cracked as she said she had been scared, unsure whether to tell him without understanding whether the man was lying, manipulating her, or warning her about something real. Ethan felt confusion clash with relief and suspicion all at once, leaving his mind unsteady. He wanted to demand details, but the fear trembling in Claire's voice held him in place. She said she had kept the meeting secret, only because she wanted to be sure before she dragged him into the unknown. The unknown now stood between them like a dark open doorway. Ethan stepped closer, unable to hold back the wave of emotion rising inside him. He asked who the man was, but Claire hesitated, looking down as if afraid of her own answer. She said the man had told her something that shook her deeply. Something about Ethan. The words hit him harder than she expected, and his breath quickened as he demanded to know what had been said. Claire explained that the man claimed Ethan had been hiding something from her, something from years ago that was now resurfacing. Ethan recoiled slightly, stunned by the accusation, unsure whether to laugh in disbelief or tremble with anger. Claire lifted her gaze, eyes pleading as she said she didn't believe the stranger. But she had needed to find out the truth for herself. Ethan felt the ground tilt again, this time with a new fear. Why would someone come to her with this? And how long had she struggled with it alone? Ethan's voice lowered, trembling as he asked what exactly the man had told her. Claire inhaled shakily, stepping close enough for her breath to mingle with his in the cold air. She said the stranger claimed Ethan had a secret that could tear their life apart. Something he had supposedly done before they met, something she had never imagined could exist. Ethan stared at her, stunned, feeling the accusation cut into him like ice. He insisted he had no idea what the man was talking about, but Claire's eyes held a fear that made him ache. She whispered that she didn't want to believe any of it, but she had been terrified of what it might mean if she ignored it. The truth hovered between them, fragile and trembling, as the cold night wrapped around their breaking silence. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the betrayal tearing them apart wasn't just about what she had done. It was about whatever someone believed he had once done. Ethan and Claire stood in the center of the dim parking lot, the silence wrapping around them like a tightening coil. The weight of her words still hung in the air, heavy enough to make Ethan's breath stumble. Claire watched him with wide, trembling eyes, as if afraid the truth she carried would shatter him completely. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, not because he doubted himself, but because the fear in her gaze revealed how deeply she had been hurting alone. He reached for her hand, but she flinched, not in rejection, but in the shock of everything suddenly unraveling. He told her he needed to see this man, needed to hear the accusations himself, to face whatever twisted story had been planted between them. Claire nodded slowly, a soft sound escaping her as though she had been waiting for him to take the lead. The night felt colder, sharper, as if the darkness itself sensed the truth they were approaching. Something unseen tightened around them, a sense that whatever came next would change everything. They drove through the quiet outskirts, following the address Claire had been given, the fading streetlights passing in slow intervals like silent markers of the unknown ahead. Claire sat rigid, her breath uneven as if every mile brought them closer to a truth she wasn't ready to face. Ethan gripped the wheel, his mind racing as fragments of doubt clashed with the steady insistence of his innocence. He rehearsed explanations he didn't yet understand, wondering who would want to break them apart with lies this precise, this cruel. Claire's voice finally broke the silence as she apologized, soft, fractured, carrying weeks of fear and secrecy. Ethan's chest tightened, not from anger, but from the raw vulnerability in her confession. He told her they would face whatever waited together, even if he didn't yet know how. The road ahead darkened, the world narrowing around their headlights as tension thickened like fog. They pulled up to a dim, nearly abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, where the only light came from a flickering bulb near the entrance. The building loomed like a forgotten relic, its silence unsettling. Claire hesitated before stepping out, her breath clouding in the cold night air. Ethan stood close beside her, scanning the shadows for movement. A part of him wondered whether the man was even real, or if this was some cruel trap designed to fracture them further. Claire whispered that she had met him inside before, that he never gave a full name, only cryptic warnings and half-truths that pushed her deeper into fear. Ethan felt anger surge, not toward her, but toward whoever had exploited her vulnerability. He placed a steadying hand on her back, guiding her forward, even as the darkness ahead pressed in like a threat. Something in the air felt charged, expectant, as if the warehouse itself held its breath. The door creaked open with a long metallic groan, echoing inside the cavernous warehouse. Claire stepped in slowly, her footsteps hesitant as Ethan stayed close behind. The interior was dim, lit only by a few hanging bulbs that buzzed faintly, casting long, restless shadows. The air smelled of dust and old wood, thick with the weight of whatever truth had been hiding here. Claire pointed toward a small table near the back, where she said the man had once waited for her. But tonight, the space was empty. Eerily so. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the room, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Claire's voice trembled as she said she didn't understand. He had told her he would be here, that he had something Ethan needed to hear. Ethan stepped further in, trying to piece together the fractured trail of fear that had led them to this place. The silence pressed down harder, as if the building itself knew something they did not. Ethan moved closer to the abandoned table, noticing a small envelope resting at its center, one Claire insisted hadn't been there before. His heart pounded as he reached for it, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Claire stepped beside him, her breath uneven as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a name scrawled across the top. His own, followed by accusations so twisted and precise they made his stomach drop. None of it was true, yet the words were crafted to wound, to divide, to break apart trust with surgical accuracy. Claire covered her mouth, tears slipping free, as she realized she had been manipulated into fear. Ethan felt a surge of protective anger, sharper than ever before. He crushed the paper in his hand, understanding now that someone wanted more than distance between them. They wanted destruction. He turned to Claire, lifting her chin gently, telling her they would face this together and find whoever had done this. For the first time in weeks, something unbroken flickered between them. Fragile, but real. The night outside waited, heavy with uncertainty, but no longer with silence.